A millionaire loses everything after betrayals by friends and partners. Abandoned by his family, he finds support in a former housekeeper. Upon discovering a forgotten patent, he sees a chance to rebuild himself. Now he must fight against betrayals and regain the trust of those who matter. The main hall of the Manhattan Grand Hotel shimmered in gold that gala night. Peter Thompson, CEO of Thompson Technologies Group, watched with satisfaction as over 300 guests mingled in their festive attire. It was his night, his moment of glory. Forbes had just announced his entry into the list of American billionaires, and the celebration needed to match the occasion. Laura, his wife of 25 years, glided through the hall in a red Valentino dress, greeting guests with the ease of someone born for the role. Their children, Michael and Richard, both already holding executive positions in the company, were chatting with potential investors in a strategic corner of the hall. The image of the perfect family built over decades of hard work and obsessive dedication. Mr. Thompson. Helen, his housekeeper of more than 15 years, approached discreetly. "I have an urgent call in the hotel's office." Peter frowned, annoyed by the interruption. "Not tonight, Helen. Tell them I'll call back tomorrow." "It's Dr. Frederick, sir. He insists it's about the company audit." A slight shiver ran down his spine, but Peter kept his social smile intact. Frederick was his chief auditor and would never bother him at an event of this magnitude without an extremely serious reason. "5 minutes," he murmured to Helen, making his way with measured steps out of the hall. On his way, he was intercepted by Robert Adams, his biggest rival in the tech market. "Peter, my dear, what an extraordinary party. We need to talk about that new patent of yours. I have an interesting proposal." "Tomorrow, Robert. Today is for celebrating," Peter replied without slowing his pace. In the private office, Frederick's voice sounded tense over the phone. "We've found serious irregularities in the offshore accounts, Peter. Someone has been making systematic transfers over the past 18 months. We're talking astronomical amounts." Peter felt his blood run cold. "How is this possible? Who has access to those accounts?" "Only you, Laura, and—" Frederick hesitated. "Your sons." The silence that followed was deafening. Peter looked through the office window, watching the party that continued in full swing in the main hall. Laura was now dancing with Robert Adams, laughing at something he whispered in her ear. Michael was deep in conversation with a group of executives, gesturing with the confidence Peter had always admired in his eldest son. Richard, the youngest, was absent, likely in some secluded area of the hotel, as was his habit. "I need more details, Frederick, now. Not over the phone, but I suggest you don't make any hasty decisions tonight. We need to analyze everything calmly tomorrow." Peter hung up the phone and remained still for a few minutes, his mind racing furiously. Years of experience in business had taught him to trust his instincts, and something told him this was just the tip of a much larger, darker iceberg. He returned to the hall with a forced smile on his lips, just in time to hear the clinking of glasses for a toast. Laura called him over with a graceful wave. "Come, darling, it's your night." Peter crossed the hall like an automaton, aware of the admiring and envious glances that followed him. He picked up a glass of champagne and stepped onto the makeshift stage, where a microphone awaited him. "Good evening, everyone." His voice sounded steady, betraying none of the storm brewing inside him. "I thank each of you for being here on this special night. The success of the Thompson Group wouldn't be possible without the support of loyal partners and a dedicated family." His eyes scanned the room, pausing for a fraction of a second on each familiar face. Laura, radiant in her red dress, but with something different in her gaze that he couldn't quite decipher. Michael, proud and confident, so much like himself in his youth. Robert Adams, with his enigmatic smile. Helen, the only one who seemed genuinely concerned for his well-being, observing everything from a discreet corner. "We've built something extraordinary together," Peter continued, raising his glass. "And this is just the beginning to the future." "To the future," echoed the chorus of enthusiastic voices. Peter downed the champagne in one gulp, feeling a bitterness that had nothing to do with the drink. In his mind, Frederick's words echoed like a dark omen. Something was about to collapse, and he needed to figure out what it was before it was too late. What Peter didn't know, as he smiled for the cameras and accepted congratulations, was that this would be his last moment of glory. From that night on, every pillar supporting his empire would begin to crumble in a sequence of events that would change his life forever. The morning after the party brought with it a sense of urgency that Peter couldn't ignore. He arrived at the office before 7, eager for his meeting with Frederick. The building of Thomson Technologies, a glass and steel skyscraper in the financial heart of New York, was still practically empty. Helen was already waiting for him with a cup of coffee in her office. "You didn't sleep well," she observed, not as a question, but as a statement. "You always know, don't you, Helen?" Peter smiled weakly, accepting the coffee. "Where's Frederick?" "He hasn't arrived yet, sir." Something in Helen's voice made him look up. There was concern on her face, more than usual. "Do you know? Something I should know?" Helen hesitated, an unusual behavior for someone always so direct. "Mr. Peter, I've worked for you for 15 years. I've seen your children grow up. I've seen this company transform into what it is today. Maybe it's time to pay more attention to who's really by your side." Before Peter could question the meaning of those cryptic words, his phone rang. It was Laura. "Peter, you need to come home right now." His wife's voice sounded strangely controlled. "Robert Adams is here with some lawyers. It's about the company." "Robert? At our house? Laura, what's going on?" "Just come. Now." The drive back to the mansion in the Upper East Side felt endless. When Peter finally arrived, he found not only Robert and the lawyers, but also Michael, his eldest son, sitting next to Laura on the living room sofa. Everyone had serious expressions. "What kind of circus is this?" Peter demanded, his voice echoing through the room. Robert Adams stood up, adjusting his Italian suit. "Peter, sit down. It's better if we discuss this civilly." "Discuss what exactly?" "Dad," Michael intervened, his voice steady. "We've uncovered the manipulations in the company's accounts, the falsified reports, the embezzlement. We have everything documented." Peter felt as if he had been punched in the gut. "What are you talking about?" Laura spoke up, her voice icy sharp. "Don't drag this out, Peter. The lawyers already have all the evidence. You've compromised not just your reputation, but the future of the entire family." Michael found out everything 3 months ago and has been working with Robert to salvage what's left of the company. "Have you all lost your minds?" Peter looked incredulously from one face to another. "I built this company from the ground up. Every penny invested, every contract signed, every offshore account," Robert interrupted softly. "Every irregular transfer, every falsified document." "The same accounts Frederick discovered," Peter began, but was cut off by a dry laugh from Michael. "Frederick?" His son smiled humorlessly. "Dad, Frederick resigned 2 weeks ago. The call yesterday wasn't from him." The world seemed to spin around Peter. The call, the veiled accusations, it had all been a ruse to keep him distracted during the party while what? "The board held an emergency meeting this morning," Robert continued, handing over a folder of documents. "As the largest minority shareholder, I've been appointed interim CEO to ensure the company's stability during the transition." "This is a coup," Peter murmured, the pieces falling into place in his mind. "You planned all of this?" "No, Peter." Laura stood up, stepping closer to him with an expression that mixed pity and disdain. "You caused this. Your obsession with power, your arrogance. You never realized you were losing everything around you while you kept accumulating more and more?" Peter looked at Michael, searching for some sign of the son he had raised, but found only a cold, calculating executive who had learned his corporate lessons all too well. "Where's Richard?" Peter suddenly asked, noticing the absence of his youngest son. "In London," Laura replied. "He chose not to be part of this. He's always been the most sensitive." The lawyers began laying out documents on the coffee table. Resignation terms, confidentiality agreements, stock transfers. Peter watched them as if trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "You have 2 options," Robert explained almost gently. "Sign voluntarily, preserving at least some of your reputation, or face a very public and unpleasant lawsuit. The choice is yours." Peter sank heavily into an armchair, feeling the weight of every gaze upon him. Helen's words from that morning echoed in his mind, "Pay more attention to who's really by your side." Now he understood the belated warning. "I need my own lawyer," he finally said. "We expected that," Laura replied, handing him a card. "We've hired Dr. Mendelsohn to represent you. He's on his way." Peter held the card between trembling fingers, realizing even his legal defense had been orchestrated by them. In less than 24 hours, his empire had begun to crumble, and the worst part was realizing the destruction came from within, from the people he had trusted the most. 3 months later, Peter watched the rain through the window of his small apartment in Brooklyn, in the northern part of New York. The contrast with his former mansion on the Upper East Side couldn't have been greater. The 400-square-foot space, furnished with basic items bought from discount stores, was all he could afford to rent with the little money he had left after the ousting process. The past few weeks had been a blur of meetings with lawyers, endless paperwork, and sensationalist headlines. Dr. Mendelsohn, as Peter soon discovered, was indeed aligned with Laura and Robert's interests. Every attempt to contest was skillfully neutralized. Every piece of evidence Peter tried to present was dismissed as irrelevant. "Mr. Peter," Helen's voice brought him back to the present. She was the only one who had stayed by his side, showing up regularly with homemade food and words of comfort. "I brought some feijoada. You need to eat properly." Peter smiled weakly. "Helen, you don't have to do this. I can't pay your salary anymore." "I'm not here for a salary," she replied simply, organizing the small kitchen with the same efficiency as always. "Have you tried talking to Richard today?" Peter shook his head. His youngest son remained in London, ignoring his attempts to reach out. The few messages he had managed to send went unanswered, marked only by the blue check mark on WhatsApp. "He reads my messages, Helen, but he doesn't reply. I think Michael convinced him I'm really guilty." Helen stopped what she was doing and looked directly at Peter. "Mr. Richard has always been different from his brother. His heart is more like yours, even if he doesn't realize it yet." Peter Thompson's phone vibrated, an unknown number. Lately, calls like these usually meant more trouble. Creditors, journalists, or worse. People he once considered friends calling to demand explanations about lost investments. "Peter Thompson," he answered, his voice still carrying a trace of the authority it once held. "Mr. Thompson, this is the front desk at the Upper East Side condominium. Your ex-wife is here with some court officers. They have a court order to remove the last belongings you still had in storage." Peter closed his eyes, feeling a new wave of humiliation. In the condo's storage unit were his last connections to his former life, family photos, personal documents, and a few sentimental items he hadn't had time to retrieve during the rushed move. "Do they have the right?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "I'm sorry, sir, the court order is clear." Helen watched the scene with concern. When Peter hung up, she approached with a cup of coffee. "What do they want now?" "Everything." "Helen?" "As always." Peter drank the coffee mechanically. "You know what's most ironic? Yesterday, I saw in the papers that the company's stock rose 15% since Robert took over. The market is responding positively to the new management, according to analysts." "You built that company," Helen said with conviction. "They may have the papers, but they can't erase that." Peter walked to the window again. Down below, life went on as usual. People rushed to take cover from the rain, street vendors set up their stalls, and buses passed by packed with passengers, a world completely different from the sterile, controlled environment he had lived in for the past few decades. "I got a job offer today," he said suddenly. "A technical school in the neighborhood needs an IT teacher. The salary is a fraction of what I used to spend on dinner, but it's a start," Helen finished. "You've always been good at explaining things. Your kids used to say that, remember?" The mention of his children brought a fresh wave of pain. Peter picked up his phone and opened the last photo he had with them, taken the night of the party. His fingers brushed across the screen, touching the smiling faces that now seemed to belong to strangers. "I need to find out the truth, Helen. Those documents that incriminated me, something isn't right. Frederick would never have resigned without speaking to me personally. And those transfers, someone set all this up." You need to be careful, Helen warned. They have a lot of power now. And I have nothing to lose, Peter replied, determination rising in his voice. I'll take that job at the school. I need to settle down, establish a new routine, but I won't give up on proving my innocence. Helen smiled faintly as she set the small table for lunch. She knew that tone of voice. It was the same one Peter had used years ago when he was building his empire from scratch. The difference was that now he wasn't blinded by ambition. The fall had changed him, made him more human. The beans will get cold, she said simply, pulling out a chair. Peter sat at the modest table, so different from the lavish dining room he used to frequent. The aroma of the stew filled the small space, bringing an unexpected sense of comfort. It was a new chapter in his life, one he never imagined he'd write. But as he savored the homemade meal, a certainty began to form in his mind. This wouldn't be his last story. The classroom at the Brooklyn Vocational Training Center was packed. 30 pairs of eyes watched Peter with curiosity as he wrote his name on the board. Some students whispered among themselves, likely recognizing his face from recent news. "Good morning," Peter began, his voice taking on a different tone than the one he used in board meetings. "I'm Professor Peter Thompson, and we'll be working together this semester on fundamentals of information technology." A student in the front row timidly raised her hand. "Professor, are you the Peter Thompson from Thompson Technologies?" Peter took a deep breath, facing the question he knew would come. "Yes, that's me, and it gives me a unique perspective to teach you about technology. Not just the theory, but how it works in the real world." To his surprise, instead of more whispers or judgmental looks, he saw genuinely interested expressions. A different energy filled the room as he began explaining operating systems using practical examples from his experience. During the break, as he organized his notes, he received a message on his phone. It was from an unknown number. "Not all is lost. Look into the files for patent 45. 892. There's something you need to see." Peter felt his heart race. Patent 45.892 was for a security system his company had developed years ago, something that had been forgotten amidst larger projects. Why would someone bring it up now? At the end of the class, as he was packing up his materials, a cleaning lady entered the room. "Professor, there's a young lady who wants to speak with you. She said it's important." At the door, he found a young woman he recognized immediately, Anna Louise, a former intern from the legal department at Thompson Technologies. "Mr. Thompson," she seemed nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder. "I need to be quick. I worked on the documentation for that patent before I was fired. There's something strange in the records. Duplicate documents, dates that don't add up. Anna, why are you telling me this now? Because what they did to you isn't fair, and because—" she hesitated, "because Richard approached me last week, asking questions about the same documents." The mention of his son's name made Peter lean against the wall to steady himself. Was Richard investigating on his own? "Where can I find these documents?" "Most of them are in the company's digital archive, but there are physical copies at the notary office on Wall Street. You're still listed as the patent holder, so you have access rights." Anna checked her watch, visibly anxious. "I need to go. I'm already risking too much by being here." Before Peter could ask more questions, she disappeared down the hallway. He stood there processing the information until his phone vibrated again. It was Helen. "Mr. Thompson, there's something you need to see. I was organizing your boxes and found an old flash drive. It has company files on it. Keep it safe, Helen. I'm on my way home." In the small apartment, Helen was waiting for him with the flash drive in hand. It was in a box of old memories, along with pictures of Richard as a child. Peter connected the device to his laptop. Most of the files were old presentations, routine reports, nothing relevant, until he found an encrypted folder. "This is strange," he murmured, trying to remember the password. After a few attempts, he smiled as he gained access. It was Richard's birth date. The contents made his blood run cold. There was a series of emails exchanged between Robert Adams and an anonymous address dated 2 years ago. The messages discussed in detail a plan to take control of the company. "My God!" Helen exclaimed, reading over his shoulder. They were planning this for so long. And there's more, Peter continued, scrolling. Look at this message. C is reluctant, but M has assured he can convince her. C and M, Laura and Michael. You need to show this to a lawyer. No, Peter closed the laptop. Not yet. If I've learned anything from all of this, it's not to trust the wrong people. We need more evidence, and now I know where to look. Helen poured a cup of coffee while Peter jotted down notes in a notebook. It was like a puzzle starting to take shape. The mysterious patent, Richard's involvement, the conspiratorial emails. Helen, Peter said suddenly, I need your help. Tomorrow I'm going to the records office to check those documents, but I can't draw attention. Could you don't even need to finish, she smiled. I can go first, like an ordinary person. Doing some research. No one pays attention to a housekeeper. Peter looked at her with gratitude. Why do you keep helping me, Helen? You've already lost so much by staying by my side. Because I know who you really are, she replied simply, and because I have my own reasons for wanting the truth to come out. There was something in her tone that caught Peter's attention, but before he could question it, his phone buzzed with a WhatsApp notification. His heart raced as he saw the name. Richard. The message was short. Dad, we need to talk, but not here. It's not safe. Central Park was practically deserted at that time of night. Peter walked near the lake, following the instructions Richard had sent in a message. His heart was racing, not just from the anticipation of the meeting, but also from the fear of a trap. The past few months had made him cautious. Dad! The familiar voice made him turn. Richard emerged from the shadows, wearing a hooded sweatshirt, so different from the Italian suits he used to wear. He was thinner, with deep dark circles under his eyes that betrayed sleepless nights. Son. Peter took a step toward him, but Richard raised his hand, keeping his distance. We need to be quick. They've been monitoring my movements since I got back from London. Richard glanced around nervously. Did you get the message about the patent? Was it you? Anna Louise. I asked her to reach out. I couldn't risk doing it directly. Richard pulled an envelope from his pocket. Here's a copy of the original patent records. Compare them with the ones at the registry office. Peter took the envelope with trembling hands. Why are you helping me now after months of silence? Because I found out things that... Richard ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that reminded Peter so much of his childhood. Michael isn't who we thought he was, Dad. He's involved in something much bigger than just taking over the company. The emails, Peter murmured. I found old exchanges between Robert and someone. It wasn't just emails. There were secret meetings, side deals. Michael started planning this years ago, ever since you filed that patent. Richard lowered his voice even further. He realized the potential of that technology before anyone else. But why did your mother agree to this? A bitter smile crossed Richard's face. Laura isn't just an accomplice. She and Robert, they've been together longer than we imagined. Peter felt as though the ground had vanished beneath his feet. The pieces were starting to come together. The frequent business dinners, the coincidental trips, Laura's unwavering support for Robert's decisions after the company takeover. There's more, Richard continued, nervously checking his watch. The patent isn't just a common security system. The code has military applications you couldn't even imagine. Michael found out and... The sound of snapping branches interrupted the conversation. Richard paled. I need to go. Don't try to contact me through the usual channels. Helen knows how to reach me. Helen? Peter frowned. What do you mean? But Richard had already disappeared into the darkness, leaving Peter with more questions than answers. On his way back home, he couldn't stop thinking about the revelations. Did Helen know more than she let on? What was her real connection to all of this? When he arrived at his apartment, he found a note from her under the door. I went to the notary today. The documents are different from the originals. Someone altered the dates and technical specifications. Be careful. I noticed I was being watched. Peter sat at his small desk, spreading out the documents Richard had brought. Comparing them with Helen's notes, the alterations became glaringly obvious. These weren't just subtle changes. Someone had completely rewritten entire sections of the patent, turning a digital security innovation into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Professor Thompson, it's Anna Louise again. Richard asked me to warn you. Michael is planning to sell the patent to a foreign company. The meeting is scheduled for next week." A chill ran down Peter's spine. If the patent truly had military applications, selling it to foreigners could have devastating consequences. This wasn't just about reclaiming his company or clearing his name. There was something much bigger at stake. A knock at the door startled him. It was Helen, looking agitated. "Mr. Thompson, we need to talk. There's something I should have told you a long time ago." She stepped inside, carrying an old folder. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "Before becoming your housekeeper, I worked for Robert Adams. I witnessed many conversations, many plans." She took a deep breath. "When I came to work for your family, it wasn't by chance. Robert placed me there to monitor the development of the patent." Peter stared at her, feeling a new wave of betrayal rising. "But something changed." Helen continued, tears in her eyes. "I saw you with your children. I saw how you built everything through honest work. I couldn't go on with it. That's why I've been helping Richard. We're trying to fix what we helped destroy." Peter remained silent, absorbing the confession. Outside, the night in New York pulsed with its usual energy, oblivious to the secrets and betrayals unfolding in that small apartment. "What exactly is in that patent, Helen?" "Something that should never have left the drawing board, Mr. Peter. Something that Michael intends to use in a way that could cause immense damage. In the wrong hands." In the small Brooklyn apartment, the kitchen table had turned into an improvised operations center. Peter and Helen were examining documents scattered across the surface, while a half-empty thermos of coffee betrayed the long night of work. "So you kept all these records for years?" Peter asked, flipping through detailed notes Helen had made about conversations and meetings. "It was my insurance," she replied, not taking her eyes off a particular document. "At first for Robert, then to protect you when I realized what was happening." Peter found an old photo among the papers. In it, Robert Adams appeared alongside a group of foreign executives. The date showed the image was from 5 years ago. "Wait," Peter brought the photo closer to his eyes. "This man here is Victor Peterson from Quantum Technologies. They've tried to buy our company several times." Helen nodded. "And now, they're the ones interested in the patent." Michael scheduled the meeting for Thursday at Quantum's office in New York. How did Richard get this information? "He has someone inside the company, someone close to Michael." Helen hesitated. "His secretary is my niece." Peter let out an incredulous laugh. "Did you build an entire network of informants over the years?" "I learned from Robert that information is power, but unlike him, I decided to use that power for good." Helen picked up another document. "Look at this. These are the original technical specifications of the patent before the modifications." Peter examined the document, his face paling as he read. "My God. The system we developed could actually be adapted to—" "Yes," Helen interrupted him. "That's why Michael is so interested. The original security technology can be reconfigured to penetrate any defense system. In the wrong hands." A knock at the door interrupted them. Peter and Helen exchanged tense glances. They weren't expecting anyone at that hour. "Mr. Peter?" Anna Louise's voice came from the other side. "It's urgent!" Helen opened the door after checking through the peephole. Anna Louise hurried in, carrying a folder and a laptop. "Michael moved the meeting up," she said without preamble. "It's tomorrow afternoon, and there's more. Laura will be there." "How did you find that out?" "Richard, he hacked into Michael's corporate email." Anna opened the laptop. "We gained access to some message exchanges between him and Quantum's executives. They're not just interested in the patent, they want the entire research and development structure of the company." Peter began pacing the room, his mind racing furiously. "If they get that, they'll have access to all the other ongoing research. Years of development." "There's more," Anna continued. "I found records of old bank transfers. Robert has been receiving payments from Quantum for years, through shell companies." Helen picked up her planner, flipping through it quickly. The dates matched the meetings he had with foreign investors. He's been planning this for a long time. And Laura? Peter asked, his voice betraying the pain he still felt. Since when has she been involved? Anna and Helen exchanged hesitant glances. Mr. Peter, Helen began softly. Laura didn't get involved with Robert afterward. She never stopped being involved with him, even before you met her. Peter sat down heavily. All this time, my entire marriage. It was arranged, Helen finished. Robert needed someone inside your life, someone who could influence your business decisions. Laura was perfect, smart, sophisticated, with connections in the business world. And Michael? He found out about Robert and Laura 3 years ago, Anna explained. Instead of confronting them, he saw an opportunity. He started negotiating his own deal with Quantum. Peter stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The nighttime city stretched out before him, lights flickering like earthly stars. Somewhere out there, his eldest son was planning the next step, in a betrayal that had begun even before he was born. We need to stop them, he said finally. We can't let them sell that technology. I have an idea, Helen said, but it's risky, and we're going to need Richard's help. Is he willing to testify? Anna asked. No, Helen smiled mysteriously. He's going to do something much better. While everyone is focused on the meeting with Quantum, Richard will have free access to Michael's office. Peter turned around, understanding the plan. The main servers, are they still in the same place? In the basement, Anna confirmed, and I still have access to the security system. I can create a distraction that will keep the guards busy long enough. Tomorrow, Peter said, feeling an old energy return. We have to act tomorrow before it's too late. Helen began gathering the documents. I'll contact my niece. We'll need to know exactly when Michael and Laura leave for the meeting. As the three of them refined the details of the plan, Peter couldn't help but notice the irony. His family had betrayed him, but he had found true loyalty in people who were initially placed in his life to spy on him. One last thing, Anna said, preparing to leave. Richard found something about the lawyer who represented you, Dr. Mendelsohn. He has an old connection to Robert's family. Peter nodded, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Tomorrow, he repeated, his voice firm. Tomorrow we start turning this game around. The clock showed 2:30 p.m. when Peter received the message from Helen. They just left for the meeting. Michael, Laura, and Robert are together in the same car. Across the street from the imposing building of Thompson Technologies, Peter watched the movement through the mirrored windows of the cafe where he was seated. Dressed in a maintenance worker's jumpsuit and wearing a cap that shaded his face, he barely resembled the executive who once commanded that empire. Post 1 confirmed, Anna Louise's voice came through the small earpiece. Security system ready for the 15-minute loop on the basement cameras. Richard? Peter asked discreetly into the hidden microphone on his collar. In position, his son's voice replied, tense. 18th floor, Michael's office. The secretary, our ally, just left for coffee. Peter took a deep breath, looking at the fake badge Helen had secured. It was now or never. Let's begin. He crossed the street with determined steps, carrying a toolbox. At the reception, he presented the badge and the forged work order for maintenance on the data center's cooling system. Basement? The security guard asked, checking the documents. Yes, an urgent call. The main server is at risk of overheating. The security guard nodded, allowing him entry. Peter felt a chill in his stomach as he passed through the turnstile. He was inside his own company like an intruder. Alert, Helen's voice sounded in his earpiece. Michael forgot a folder and sent the driver back to get it. You have 10 minutes before he arrives. Peter quickened his pace to the service elevator. In the basement, the cold lights of the servers flickered like technological stars. He knew the place like the back of his hand. He had personally supervised the installation of every piece of equipment. Camera loop activated, Anna confirmed. 15 minutes starting now. With nimble fingers, Peter connected a small device provided by Richard to the main server. Codes began to run on the laptop screen he had brought. Found it, he murmured after a few tense minutes. The original patent files. They're all here. And more. records of all modifications made with user identification. Dad, Richard's voice sounded urgent. Something's wrong. I just found encrypted emails on Michael's computer. The meeting with Quantum. It's not just about the patent. They're planning to transfer the entire company's operations to a tax haven. What? That would leave thousands of employees jobless, Richard continued. And there's more. I found records of bribes, kickbacks. A noise in the hallway made Peter freeze. The driver arrived earlier than expected, Helen warned, panicked. He's coming down with 2 security guards. Peter looked around, desperate. The file download wasn't complete yet. Richard, how much time do you need? 3 more minutes to copy everything. Anna, can you extend the camera loop? Negative, she replied. The system will reboot in 40 seconds. Peter heard voices approaching. In a moment of inspiration, he pulled one of the cooling panels, causing a sharp hiss and a small cloud of steam. Hey, you there! One of the security guards appeared at the door. What are you doing? Emergency maintenance, Peter replied without turning around, his voice deliberately hoarse. The cooling system collapsed. If we don't fix it now, we could lose the entire server. The guard hesitated, looking at the steam coming from the panel. Let him work, the driver said. I just came to pick up the folder Dr. Michael forgot. Peter continued pretending to work on the panel, his heart pounding as he heard the men rummaging through the room next door. Download complete, Richard whispered in his ear. Get out, now. Helen's voice was filled with urgency. Michael just called the head of security. He realized he forgot something more important in the folder. Peter disconnected the device with trembling hands, hiding it at the bottom of his tool bag. System restored, he announced loudly, closing the panel. Temperature returning to normal. He left the basement trying to stay calm, passing by the guards who barely paid him any attention. In the elevator, however, his blood ran cold. Laura was entering the main lobby. Change of plans, he whispered into the microphone. Laura. Is here, Richard, get out now. I can't, his son replied. I haven't copied all the files about the bribes yet. Son, it's not worth the risk. Yes, it is, Dad. I need to fix my part in all of this. Peter reached the ground floor, his heart nearly leaping out of his mouth when he saw Laura walking toward him. She passed by him without a second glance, absorbed in a phone call. Head to marketing now, Helen commanded in his ear. Anna created a distraction on the 8th floor. All the guards are heading there. Peter followed the instructions, meeting Richard at the agreed spot in the emergency staircase minutes later. His son was pale, but wore a triumphant smile. We did it, Dad. We have everything. The original patent files, the evidence of illegal modifications, the records of bribes, even personal emails between Laura and Robert from years ago. They quickly made their way down to the garage, where Helen was waiting for them in an unassuming car. What did Michael forget? Peter asked as they drove away from the building. The USB drive with the real contracts for Quantum, Helen replied. They created 2 versions, one to present to the board and another with the actual terms of the deal. And now? Now, Richard smiled. We're heading to the meeting. They're not the only ones who can make a dramatic entrance. The car sped down the avenue as Peter reviewed the files on his laptop. Each document revealed a new layer of the conspiracy. Each email exposed a new betrayal. But for the first time in months, he felt the tide was beginning to turn. The office of Quantum Technologies occupied 3 floors of a luxurious building on Wall Street. Peter, Richard, and Helen watched the building from a cafe across the street, waiting for Anna Louise's signal. I got access to the electronic calendar. Anna's voice came through the earpiece. They're in the 15th floor conference room. Victor Peterson just arrived with his team of lawyers. Peter adjusted his tie. He was now wearing an impeccable suit chosen by Helen. Are you sure you want to do this, son? Richard nodded, his expression resolute. I've hidden for too long, Dad. It's time to face Michael and show that not all of his children are like him. Remember, Helen interjected, you have backup copies of all the files in 3 different places. No matter what happens in there, the evidence is safe. Peter took a deep breath and stood up. The cafe's maitre d' approached with an elegant briefcase. Inside were not business documents, but all the evidence of the manipulations and betrayals of the past few years. Mr. Thompson, the maitre d' hesitated. I know it's none of my business, but my son interned at your company years ago. You always treated your employees well. What they did to you isn't fair. Peter smiled, touched by the unexpected comment. Thank you. Sometimes we need to lose everything to find out who's really on our side. In the building's lobby, they introduced themselves as representatives of an investment fund interested in Thompson Technologies. The forged badges made by Anna worked perfectly. 15th floor, the security guard indicated, platinum room. In the elevator, Peter felt his heart race. Months of humiliation and suffering culminated in this moment. Dad, Richard whispered, no matter what happens, can you forgive me for taking so long to stand by your side? Peter squeezed his son's shoulder, unable to speak due to the emotion. The elevator doors opened directly into the reception area of the meeting room. Through the glass walls they could see the meeting in progress. Michael was standing, presenting something on a large screen. Laura and Robert sat side by side, their hands discreetly intertwined under the table. Victor Peterson watched the presentation with calculated interest. The secretary intercepted them. Can I help you? Tell Mr. Peterson that Peter Thompson would like to discuss patent 45,892, Peter announced loudly, deliberately drawing the attention of those present. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael stopped mid-sentence, his face paling. Laura stood up abruptly, knocking over a glass of water. Robert remained motionless, only his eyes betraying the sudden tension. Victor Peterson was the first to react. Peter, what a pleasant surprise. Please come in. This is absurd, Michael exploded. He has no authority to be here. I'm calling security. Before you do that, Michael, Richard stepped into the room. Perhaps you'd like to explain to Mr. Peterson about the two versions of the contract, or about the files I found on your computer today. Laura gasped upon seeing her youngest son. Richard, you've been with your father all this time? No, Mom, I was searching for the truth, and I found much more than I expected. Peter opened his briefcase, spreading documents across the meeting table. Mr. Peterson, before signing anything, perhaps you'd like to see the actual specifications of the patent. And also, he slid some printed emails toward the Russian businessman, the proof that Robert has been receiving payments from Quantum for years through shell companies. Peterson picked up the documents, his face hardening as he read. Even personal emails between Laura and Robert from years ago. They quickly made their way down to the garage, where Helen was waiting for them in an unassuming car. What did Michael forget? Peter asked as they drove away from the building. The USB drive with the real contracts for Quantum, Helen replied. They created two versions, one to present to the board and another with the actual terms of the deal. And now, Richard smiled, we're heading to the meeting. They're not the only ones who can make a dramatic entrance. The car sped down the avenue as Peter reviewed the files on his laptop. Each document revealed a new layer of the conspiracy. Each email exposed a new betrayal. But for the first time in months, he felt the tide was beginning to turn. The office of Quantum Technologies occupied 3 floors of a luxurious building on Wall Street. Peter, Richard, and Helen watched the building from a cafe across the street, waiting for Anna Louise's signal. I got access to the electronic calendar, Anna's voice came through the earpiece. They're in the 15th floor conference room. Victor Peterson just arrived with his team of lawyers. Peter adjusted his tie. He was now wearing an impeccable suit, chosen by Helen. Are you sure you want to do this, son? Richard nodded, his expression resolute. I've hidden for too long, Dad. It's time to face Michael and show that not all of his children are like him. Remember, Helen interjected, you have backup copies of all the files in 3 different places. No matter what happens in there, the evidence is safe. Peter took a deep breath and stood up. The cafe's maitre d' approached with an elegant briefcase. Inside were not business documents, but all the evidence of the manipulations and betrayals of the past few years. Mr. Thompson, the maitre d' hesitated. I know it's none of my business, but my son interned at your company years ago. You always treated your employees well. What they did to you isn't fair. Peter smiled, touched by the unexpected comment. "Thank you. Sometimes we need to lose everything to find out who's really on our side." In the building's lobby, they introduced themselves as representatives of an investment fund interested in Thompson Technologies. The forged badges made by Anna worked perfectly. 15th floor, the security guard indicated. Platinum room. In the elevator, Peter felt his heart race. Months of humiliation and suffering culminated in this moment. "Dad," Richard whispered, "no matter what happens, can you forgive me for taking so long to stand by your side?" Peter squeezed his son's shoulder, unable to speak due to the emotion. The elevator doors opened directly into the reception area of the meeting room. Through the glass walls, they could see the meeting in progress. Michael was standing, presenting something on a large screen. Laura and Robert sat side by side, their hands discreetly intertwined under the table. Victor Peterson watched the presentation with calculated interest. The secretary intercepted them. "Can I help you? Tell Mr. Peterson that Peter Thompson would like to discuss patent 45,892, Peter announced loudly, deliberately drawing the attention of those present. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael stopped mid-sentence, his face paling. Laura stood up abruptly, knocking over a glass of water. Robert remained motionless, only his eyes betraying the sudden tension. Victor Peterson was the first to react. "Peter, what a pleasant surprise. Please come in." "This is absurd," Michael exploded. "He has no authority to be here. I'm calling security." "Before you do that, Michael," Richard stepped into the room, "perhaps you'd like to explain to Mr. Peterson about the two versions of the contract, or about the files I found on your computer today." Laura gasped upon seeing her youngest son. "Richard, you've been with your father all this time." "No, Mom. I was searching for the truth, and I found much more than I expected." Peter opened his briefcase, spreading documents across the meeting table. "Mr. Peterson, before signing anything, perhaps you'd like to see the actual specifications of the patent. And also," he slid some printed emails toward the Russian businessman, "the proof that Robert has been receiving payments from Quantum for years, through shell companies." Peterson picked up the documents, his face hardening as he read. Robert stood up, his usual calm finally breaking. "This is ridiculous. Peter is trying to sabotage a legitimate deal because he can't accept that he lost the company due to his own incompetence." "Incompetence?" Peter smiled coldly. "Or was it because of the plan you started scheming over 20 years ago? Laura, why don't you tell Mr. Peterson about your meetings with Robert even before our marriage?" Laura staggered, leaning on the table. Michael looked from one face to another, realizing his carefully laid plan was crumbling before his. "So concerned with ethics, with doing the right thing. And that's why he's standing tall now," Richard interrupted, "while you're about to face charges for fraud and market manipulation." Helen, who was checking messages on her phone, cleared, her throat discreetly. "The federal police are on their way. They have search and seizure warrants for the homes of everyone involved." Robert paled. "We need to go. Laura, we have to—" "She stays," Peter said firmly. "No more running, no more lies." Laura looked up, meeting her ex-husband's gaze. For a moment, something from the past flickered between them, not love, but perhaps an acknowledgement of what could have been if different choices had been made. "You're right," she said softly. "I'm tired of running." Michael, seeing his plan completely unravel, tried one last move. "Dad, we can negotiate. I have other information, other contacts." "No, Michael." Peter interrupted, a deep sadness in his voice. "Don't you see that it's exactly this kind of negotiation that brought us here? Always looking for the next deal, the next advantage, forgetting what truly matters." The sound of sirens began to be heard in the distance. Richard approached his father, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. Helen remained close, her presence a silent anchor of loyalty. "Mr. Peter," Anna called from the door, "the press is already gathering downstairs. What should I tell them?" Peter looked out the window of the meeting room, observing the city that had witnessed his rise, fall, and now his redemption. "Tell them the truth, Anna. Just the truth." As the sound of sirens grew closer, each person in the room faced the weight of their choices. Laura, lost in memories of a life built on lies. Michael, his arrogance finally shattered by the reality of his actions. Robert, frantically calculating his dwindling options. And Peter, in the midst of it all, realized that true victory lay not in revenge or the recovery of power, but in the liberation that truth provided. Looking at Richard and Helen, he found the family he had always wanted. Not perfect, but sincere. The front page of the country's major newspapers bore the same headline that morning: "Scandal at Thompson Technologies. Family conspiracy topples empire." Peter watched the news on his tablet while having coffee in his small Brooklyn apartment, which no longer seemed so cramped or humble. It was his refuge, the place where his true recovery had begun. "You need to see this," Helen hurried in, turning on the television. On the news, Robert Adams was being escorted by federal agents, trying to hide his face from the cameras. The reporter narrated the events with visible excitement. Following yesterday's explosive revelations, federal police executed search and seizure warrants at several residences. Robert Adams, current CEO of Thompson Technologies, has been placed under preventive detention. Documents reveal a scheme of fraud and manipulation spanning more than 2 decades. Peter's phone rang. It was Richard. "Dad, we need to talk. I'm at the hospital." "Hospital? What happened?" "It's Michael." Richard hesitated. He tried... Well, he's not doing well, Dad. He's under psychiatric observation." Peter closed, his eyes feeling a pain he hadn't expected. Despite everything, Michael was still his son. "I'm on my way." At the hospital, he found Richard in the reception cafe. His younger son looked exhausted, but there was a new maturity in his gaze. "The doctors say he had a nervous breakdown," Richard explained. "When the police arrived at his house last night, he went into a state of complete denial. He started tearing up documents, breaking things, screaming that none of it was real. And his mother. She's been giving a statement to the federal police since early this morning. Her lawyer says she's cooperating, telling them everything." Richard stirred his coffee, deep in thought. "You know what's the strangest part, Dad? For the first time, she's being genuine. It's like a huge weight has been lifted off her shoulders." Anna Louise rushed into the cafe, out of breath. "Mr. Peter, the company board has called an emergency meeting. They want you there." "Me?" "The patent is still in your name," she reminded him. "And with Robert arrested and Michael, well, they need someone who knows the company inside and out." Peter looked at Richard, who nodded slightly. "Go, Dad. I'll stay with Michael." On his way to the company, Peter received a message from Helen. "The employees are organizing a rally in support of you in front of the building." Indeed, when he arrived at the headquarters of Thompson Technologies, Peter found hundreds of employees gathered, many holding signs with messages of support. As he stepped out of the car, he was greeted with applause. "Mr. Peter," an elderly man approached, visibly emotional. "I'm Joseph from maintenance. I've worked here for 18 years. We never believed the accusations against you." Tears unexpectedly welled up in Peter's eyes. Amid all the family betrayal, here was his real family, the people who had helped build the company from the ground up. In the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. Executives and board members were arguing nervously when Peter entered, accompanied by Anna. "Mr. Thompson," the board chairman stood up, "we have a lot to discuss. And first, we owe you an apology. We were deceived just as much as you were." "I'm not here to accept apologies," Peter replied, sitting down. "I'm here for the 3,000 employees downstairs who depend on this company to support their families." The meeting stretched on for hours. Peter presented a restructuring plan, focusing on the ethical development of the original patented technology. To everyone's surprise, he also proposed a profit-sharing program for the employees. "You want to distribute shares to the employees?" one board member asked, incredulous. "I want to create a real sense of belonging," Peter explained. "It was greed for control that brought us here. It's time to do things differently." At the end of the day, on his way home, Peter received a text from Laura. "Can we talk? No lawyers, no accusations, just talk." Helen, who was driving, noticed his hesitation. "Sometimes, Mr. Thompson, we need to face our ghosts to truly move forward." "And you think I should?" "I think you're no longer the man who can be manipulated," she smiled. And maybe she's no longer the woman who only knew how to manipulate either. In the small apartment, Peter found a letter from Michael delivered by Richard. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope. "Dad, I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But for the first time in my life, I see clearly the monster I've become. The doctor says I have a long road ahead. I don't know if we'll ever be a family again, but I want you to know that I finally understand what you always said. Success without integrity isn't success. It's just a beautiful facade for a rotten building. Your son, Michael." Peter folded the letter carefully. Through the window, the sun was setting over New York, painting the sky in shades of orange. It was the end of a day that marked not a full stop, but the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. Bryant Park, in the Greenwich Village neighborhood, was practically empty that Sunday morning. Peter arrived first, choosing a bench near the small pond. It was a special place. It was there he had proposed to Laura 26 years ago. The irony of choosing this location for their meeting wasn't lost on him. "You still like coming here?" Peter turned at the sound of the familiar voice. Laura looked different. No makeup, dressed simply, seeming more real than he had ever seen her in all their years of marriage. "Some memories are hard to erase," he replied, gesturing to the spot beside him on the bench. Laura sat down, maintaining a respectful distance. For a few minutes, they simply watched the ducks swimming placidly in the pond. "I was 19 when I met Robert," she began suddenly. "I was an intern at his company, full of dreams and ambitions. He saw something in me, not love, but potential for his plans." Peter remained silent, letting her continue. "When he found out about the promising young entrepreneur who was revolutionizing the tech market, he saw an opportunity. He trained me, shaped me to be exactly the kind of woman who would catch your attention. And it worked perfectly," Peter commented without bitterness in his voice. "At first it was just a plan," Laura continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But then something unexpected happened. I started to like you, truly. Your kindness, your integrity, they were so different from everything I knew. But it wasn't enough." "No," she admitted, "because I was already too corrupted. Power, money, influence. They were like a drug. And Robert knew exactly how to manipulate that." Peter turned to face her. "And Michael, when did he come into the plan?" Laura closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "Michael was always more like me than I wanted to admit. He figured out the truth about Robert and me when he was 16. Instead of confronting us, he saw an opportunity to secure his own power." "And Richard?" "Richard is his exact copy," she smiled sadly. "I tried to shape him like I did with Michael, but he always resisted. Now I understand that it saved him." A gentle breeze stirred the trees in the park, carrying the scent of freshly bloomed flowers. Peter realized that the anger he had expected to feel had been replaced by something else, a kind of melancholic understanding. "You know what's most ironic," Laura continued. "The whole plan, all the manipulation, that it was unnecessary. You would have shared everything naturally if we had been honest. Your generosity was always your most defining trait. Why are you telling me all this now?" "Because for the first time in my life I'm feeling the weight of the truth, Peter. At the police station, when I started talking, it was like a dam had burst. I couldn't stop. And with every revelation, I felt a piece of that artificial Laura dying. And who is the real Laura?" She laughed softly, a sad sound. "That's the question I'm trying to answer. I spent so much time being what others wanted me to be that I lost my own essence along the way." "The doctors say Michael had a breakdown," Peter commented. "Did you know?" "Yes," she whispered, "and I feel responsible. Not just for his actions, but for creating an environment where lies were valued more than the truth." Peter noticed a young family passing by, father, mother, and two small children, all laughing at some private joke. "We could have been happy," he reflected. "Truly." "Yes, we could have," Laura agreed. "But maybe we needed to go through all of this to truly understand the value of honesty. What will you do now?" "I'll face the consequences of my actions," she replied with a firmness Peter had never seen before. I'm cooperating with the investigations, returning everything I received illegally, and after that, I need to learn to live with the truth. And Robert? Robert is part of my past, she said simply. A past I don't intend to carry into the future. Peter stood up, feeling it was time to leave. You know, Laura, despite everything, you gave me 2 wonderful children, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Peter, she called as he walked away. That patent, what will you do with it? He smiled, a genuine smile for the first time in a long while. I'll use it for what it was originally created for, to protect people, not manipulate them. And a portion of the profits will go toward a scholarship program for underprivileged youth. Laura nodded, understanding. This was the Peter she had known and, for a brief moment, truly loved. A man whose natural kindness outweighed any desire for revenge. Goodbye, Laura, he said softly. Goodbye, Peter. And will you forgive me? Peter paused for a moment, considering the question. Forgiveness is a process, Laura, and I think we've just taken the first step. As he walked away through the park, Peter felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real, and after so many years of lies, reality, no matter how painful, was a precious gift. 6 months later, the meeting room at Thomson Technologies had a different air. The old leather chairs had been replaced with more modern and welcoming furniture, and the once austere walls now displayed photos of employees and their families. Peter observed the transformation with satisfaction as he waited for the board meeting to begin. The quarterly numbers are in, Anna Louise entered, carrying her ever-present notebook. The employee participation program has been an absolute success. Productivity has increased by 40%. Richard, now the company's director of innovation, smiled from across the table. And the best part, the applications of the patent in digital security have already benefited over 50,000 people. The door opened again and Helen entered, no longer as a housekeeper, but as the coordinator of the company's newly established social program. The first group of scholarship recipients starts next month, and Robert knew exactly how to manipulate that. Peter turned to face her. And Michael, when did he come into the plan? Laura closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. Michael was always more like me than I wanted to admit. He figured out the truth about Robert and me when he was 16. Instead of confronting us, he saw an opportunity to secure his own power. And Richard? Richard is his exact copy, she smiled sadly. I tried to shape him like I did with Michael, but he always resisted. Now I understand that it saved him. A gentle breeze stirred the trees in the park, carrying the scent of freshly bloomed flowers. Peter realized that the anger he had expected to feel had been replaced by something else, a kind of melancholic understanding. You know what's most ironic? Laura continued. The whole plan, all the manipulation, it was unnecessary. You would have shared everything naturally if we had been honest. Your generosity was always your most defining trait. Why are you telling me all this? Now, because for the first time in my life I'm feeling the weight of the truth, Peter. At the police station, when I started talking, it was like a dam had burst. I couldn't stop. And with every revelation, I felt a piece of that artificial Laura dying. And who is the real Laura? She laughed softly, a sad sound. That's the question I'm trying to answer. I spent so much time being what others wanted me to be that I lost my own essence along the way. The doctors say Michael had a breakdown, Peter commented. Did you know? Yes, she whispered, and I feel responsible, not just for his actions, but for creating an environment where lies were valued more than the truth. Peter noticed a young family passing by, father, mother, and 2 small children, all laughing at some private joke. We could have been happy, he reflected. Truly. Yes, we could have, Laura agreed. But maybe we needed to go through all of this to truly understand the value of honesty. What will you do now? I'll face the consequences of my actions, she replied with a firmness Peter had never seen before. I'm cooperating with the investigations, returning everything I received illegally, and after that, I need to learn to live with the truth. And Robert? Robert is part of my past, she said simply. A past I don't intend to carry into the future. Peter stood up, feeling it was time to leave. You know, Laura, despite everything, you gave me 2 wonderful children, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Peter, she called as he walked away. That patent, what will you do with it? He smiled, a genuine smile for the first time in a long while. I'll use it for what it was originally created for, to protect people, not manipulate them. And a portion of the profits will go toward a scholarship program for underprivileged youth. Laura nodded, understanding. This was the Peter she had known and for a brief moment truly loved, a man whose natural kindness outweighed any desire for revenge. Goodbye, Laura, he said softly. Goodbye, Peter. And will you forgive me? Peter paused for a moment, considering the question. Forgiveness is a process, Laura, and I think we've just taken the first step. As he walked away through the park, Peter felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real, and after so many years of lies, reality, no matter how painful, was a precious gift. 6 months later, the meeting room at Thompson Technologies had a different air. The old leather chairs had been replaced with more modern and welcoming furniture, and the once austere walls now displayed photos of employees and their families. Peter observed the transformation with satisfaction as he waited for the board meeting to begin. The quarterly numbers are in, Anna Louise entered, carrying her ever-present notebook. The employee participation program has been an absolute success. Productivity has increased by 40%. Richard, now the company's director of innovation, smiled from across the table. And the best part, the applications of the patent in digital security have already benefited over 50,000 people. The door opened again, and Helen entered, no longer as a housekeeper, but as the coordinator of the company's newly established social program. The first group of scholarship recipients starts next month, 20 young people from underserved communities, all with brilliant potential in technology. Peter watched the scene with a mix of pride and gratitude. The company was no longer just a business. It had transformed into something greater, more meaningful. I have news about Michael, Richard commented softly. The therapy is helping. He asked to visit the company next week. Peter nodded. After 3 months of intensive treatment, his eldest son was slowly finding his way back. Not to the company. That bridge had been burned, but perhaps to the family. And how is he handling the family? He murmured to himself, looking at Richard, Helen, and Anna Louise, each busy with their tasks but all united by something greater than blood ties or business contracts. True family is the one we choose, and the one that chooses us. Back. The phone rang. It was Michael, wanting to confirm his visit next week. His son's voice still carried the weight of guilt, but there was also a new note of hope. It was a beginning. And sometimes Peter reflected as he hung up, new beginnings are the best parts of our stories.